Hey guys and girls, Bored now, back with you. On this video I will be talking about the third episode of Starsplay's drama series Heels, and the episode is called Cheap Heat. So this is the best episode of the first three, quite easily for me. I can't really fault too much in this episode. I thought it told a very good story. I really liked the direction it went at the end of the episode and the drama with Jack and with Ace. And also some good stuff with Jack's wife, Stacy, for the first time actually, because in the previous two episodes I wasn't so keen on what they were doing with her. But in this episode they actually give her something a bit more meaty and interesting. So that was a plus also. And obviously, in a moment, I have to talk about the CM Punk cameo because CM Punk, real life wrestler, just to say that in case, someone listening to this doesn't follow wrestling and wouldn't know that, it's worth saying one of the big wrestlers of the current day, one of the big modern wrestlers, and obviously making a splash right now because of his dramatic debut for AEW recently. So a lot of talk and hype around CM Punk, and he's obviously dabbled his hand in acting a little bit. He was in a couple of horror movies, sort of 2-3 years back. Girl on the Third Floor, also the Rabid remake from the Saskia sisters. So he has been in a few films here and there, but he gets a cameo here, obviously playing a wrestler. Ricky Rabus, who's this sort of colourful, like local babyface who was sort of brought in by Jack, partly because he knew his father, but also to kind of, the idea is to kind of warm up the crowd and bring a crowd in, and that's sort of how he justifies it to Ace, who gets really pissed at him at one point because he thinks, oh yeah, you're bringing in this colourful, charismatic sort of babyface who's going to overshadow me. I mean, I've got this big main event comeback match with Bobby, and now you're bringing in Ricky Ravers, and then he's going to overshadow me. And that's kind of how Jack justifies it. That it's just a name, a one-off appearance to get some fans in and to actually put attention on the product. And I think what's interesting about the way Jack acts in this episode and about the way he tries to justify stuff like that to Ace is, and it's partly in Amal's performance, which has been really good all along, but I think it's actually quite hard to tell whether Jack is actually being selfish and just doing stuff to like upend Ace and to like keep himself in the spotlight. Because obviously a big theme in this episode is him trying to encourage Ace to turn heel, to go full blown heel, because he's started to get a bit of like legit heat from the fans from the match a couple of weeks ago when obviously things took a turn. Jack, kind of went against the script and legit sort of hurt Ace, and Ace sort of turned on him, and just the way it played out from the fans' point of view, they started booing him. And again, there's sort of this argument that maybe Jack is doing that for his own reasons more than because he thinks it's good for the show, or it could be good for Ace. And there is I think you get a sense of how tough it can be being the promoter at times, the promoter, the head booker at times in this episode. All the different things Jack has to do. He has to like juggle certain backstage tensions because at one point there's a bit of jealousy from one of the guys. The guy who was hosting the karaoke in the previous episode, who's getting a bit jealous because Bobby's been given this sort of plum spot in the main event with Ace, and Jack has to try and talk him down. He says, "Don't worry, you're in my future plans. You will be champion at some time." Just stuff like that. And again, it's another quite clever scene, because it's one of those scenes where it could be that Jack is just feeding him a line just to keep him happy and settle him down, or it could be that, he actually means that, then he actually intends to put the belt on him. But I think that's what's interesting about the dynamic with Jack and Ace in this episode. Now, Ace is a total asshole, and we see that come out full blown in this episode, and it is hard to sympathise with him because of that. I think when he goes full blown heel in the centre of the ring later and acts really jerky backstage, I think we see why this actor has been cast, and that's sort of him at his fullest. But there's obviously lots of grey areas with Jack. It's a little harder, and it's not always easy to like him. I did find that in the first episode, partly because of how seriously he takes himself, because I think when I did the first review, I sort of used like this analogy to do with Bret Hart. Bret Hart, obviously highly respected wrestler, one of the all-time great wrestlers, and I was a big fan of his growing up, still am, but people in the industry do say Bret takes himself ridiculously seriously, too seriously at times, and I just saw certain things similar to that in Jack's character, really. So that's just something that struck me. So I'll talk a bit more about the stuff with Ricky Ray, but I will say actually the episode opens with a really dark scene, because it's a flashback to when Jack and Ace's father committed suicide, and it's sort of one of those things where he's doing like this random everyday chore before he's actually mowing the lawn. So that's a nice little sort of callback to the I think it's the previous episode, and the stuff with Jack and Stacey over him not mowing the lawn or not getting the lawnmower fixed. So it's just this connective sort of scene where the father's mowing the lawn, and then he shoots himself, and it's actually Ace who finds him. He comes home first and finds him, and obviously breaks down. And that's an interesting choice, because I sort of would have thought they would have had Jack find him, but I think the reason they went with Ace is because then it's a way to sort of motivate him, or to maybe show why he's ended up so kind of messed up and a little bit up his own, well, a lot up his own arse in many ways. Not than saying, you shouldn't have sympathy with someone like that, but I think when you watch the episode play out and you see Ace become a full-blown douche, not just as a wrestling character, but as like as a person, the way he treats people backstage, then the fact that it's anchored by this opening scene where he finds his dead father is kind of, does a nice job of like piecing that sort of plot together, I think, and maybe some, this is kind of why. It's also worth saying then one thing I liked about the episode also is then you have some lighter moments, because there haven't been enough of those over the first couple of episodes. So there are some good lighter touches, sort of like when Jack is talking to like this local like promoter. Not promoter, sorry, but the local sponsor, because they're sponsored by like a local preacher or a local church, and they come to the show, and there's sort of just this gag where they're sort of saying, well, we can have you on the ring mats kind of thing, or on the canvas like your logo, but then they're sort of like the religious guy just keeps pushing it more, and and he sort of gets Jack to sing like this cheesy religious song, which they used to sing when he was a kid. And it's another clever scene because it's a very cringe sort of scene where Jack is, you can tell he feels uncomfortable and he's quite annoyed at, almost like he's being shown up, and it's that thing of, well, you're a sponsor, but we've already got you. I've already said you can have a logo on the canvas, and now you're sort of pushing it further because they're talking about like doing TV spots and what have you. So it's that kind of thing where Jack is just saying, yeah, or just thinking. I think you can see in his body language, yeah, some people are just never happy. And it's just this, it's a funny scene in one way because of the cheesy song and what have you, but it's also an uncomfortable scene for Jack. So I think a scene like that is like, has a good sort of like balance. And another funny scene that made me laugh is actually the debate between Jack and Ace early in the episode about, because Ace is like determined just to play this sort of like stereotypical heroic sort of like baby face, where he's like, well, good triumphs evil and that adversity, all that, because he's working on his promo at one point. And there's an interesting bit with Crystal, who again is treated really badly by Ace in this episode, but she's like making little suggestions about how he could tweak the promo, and pretty sensible suggestions as well. But he's I guess it just, this episode does a good job of showing how self-centered and how just it has to be Ace's way. He doesn't want to take any ideas from anyone else. I guess that sort of goes into the stuff with Jack, because he doesn't want to hear what Jack's saying. He's just like, hey, this is the way I'm going to do it. I want to be the star, because I think that's what we get from the episode as well. Just the size of his ego, the fact that he thinks, well, I want everybody to love me. That's why I want to stay being the baby face. And obviously the scene itself, where he fully turns, it's an interesting scene because he goes against the script, because he actually, in his match with Bobby, he starts acting like really aggressive, like more than he would have been, and he's kind of a dick to Bobby because he sort of like lays it in stiffer than he needs to, and he just starts acting heelish when he is meant to be the babyface, which actually, funnily enough, Jack does approve of. You can see Jack's reaction, but it's just this sort of funny thing where Ace takes things into his own hands and sort of makes that decision. But the way they play at the end of the episode is, it's like, well, be careful what you wish for, Jack, because that's when he starts being a dick backstage. He's like really mean to Crystals when she tries to comfort. It's like, get off me, who do you think you are, my girlfriend? And then he calls Willie a bitch. Stuff like that, which obviously Jack takes him aside about, but he outright says to Jack, well, this is what you wanted, right? A heel. So I'm being a heel. So it's almost like he's saying, well, I'm going to live it now. I'm going to, even away from the crowd, I'm going to like still be doing it and treating people like shit. And it's almost, yeah, it's this sort of dark term where he's kind of saying, because in a way, the way it comes across is that, yeah, I didn't want to do this. You sort of forced my hand, Jack, and now you've got to live with it. So it's almost like he's using it as an excuse to be like a real life douche and monster. But actually, the bit I was talking about before is like, there's just this funny debate between him and Jack about good triumphing over evil, and Jack is very deadpan in the scene, as he is a lot of the time, but he's like, well, it's not true though. and it just becomes this back and forth between them when they're debating it, and that's actually another sort of good, funny scene. It's a scene that works because of what it's setting up later, but it's a lighter scene as well, which I did appreciate that. I think the first two episodes could have done with lighter scenes. But yeah, the CM Punk stuff is interesting because what they do with Punk is when you see him backstage and he's being like quite friendly, he's like signing autographs, taking pictures and stuff. He's sort of there with, well, what we think is his family at the time. Well, certainly he's got a kid there, and it's a valet who we think is his wife, but we sort of find out later that he's going home later to his actual wife. So it's one of those, but anyway, he's sort of playing the nice guy backstage. And I think what's interesting about what they do with Punk in the episode is then the character he's sort of playing backstage and the way he talks to Jack is quite similar to Punk's sort of heel character that then he's been known for, like this sort of straight edge style character where there's something just a little too false, a little too forced about him, but he's sort of, I think he's very convincing as a nice guy, but as someone who's also quite patronising with it, and I think he'll just sneak in like the occasional line, and I think that's what we're meant to get from a lot of his stuff in the episode, that then he is kind of, he wants to play the nice guy angle, but really there's something else sort of going on, and he's a little insincere, and that's quite true to like the character Punk has played at times in wrestling. So that works well, but then what's interesting is that later on they sort of twist that around because, and again, I think they're obviously playing up than a lot of times when a wrestler goes through the curtain and becomes like a character, it's almost like completely different, because that's what we see in this episode when he goes out there as like Ricky Rabus. He dresses up as like, he's got like fur on, and he's got this whole wolf, and he's got his family with him, and they're kind of dressed in fur as well, and it's all very sort of cheesy and colourful and quite cartoonish, but again, something which definitely the sort of character you've seen in the past in wrestling, but but yeah, I think actually that's quite a clever thing to do. It's almost like Rabus is completely different when he goes out, you know, from the curtain. So that's almost a commentary on wrestling, but maybe also this idea that yes, some guys are like just an extension of themselves, and others have to hide behind this facade. So it's almost like it's another layer of facade, him just going out as this more cheesy, goofy type character. So I appreciated that, and Punk gives a solid performance. I thought he's very kind of believable in the episode. So that was good stuff. And the other stuff which is interesting, as I said, is the stuff with Stacey. Because I think, again, the women sort of get a rough deal in the show, and I still feel that a little bit because I've liked some of the stuff they're doing with Crystal, but at the same time, you're just sort of wondering when they're gonna like let her off the leash almost, and you sort of do feel it's still a very masculine type show. And because in this episode we get another kind of over the top sex scene with Crystal and Ace, because at one point when Ace is like sort of mad and goes back to the dressing room, like she just has sex with him almost as a way to like calm him down. And I think the show would probably make the excuse that, hey, we're just showing kind of sexism and the sort of the roles that women are put in and stuff like that, because I think also with Willie, although I quite like the character of Willie and solid actress playing her, but I think also there's just this sense of her just being this kind of sounding board and being this just supportive figure for Jack in a way, and maybe in some ways quite progressive, like a female producer and stuff in a wrestling company. But yeah, just stuff like that. I feel like, and obviously I've commented on how Stacey in previous episode has been given a bit of short of shaft. Now they actually do something interesting with her in this episode, and that is that she goes for a night out with some friends, and they're obviously having a good time, and that they're at a restaurant, and you get the impression it's the first time they've met up in a long time, so they're having like conversations about their lives, and it's just sort of funny listening to them. But then things take a turn when like the waiter is like all excited because it's one of those things, I think, in a small town sometimes, like something like the local wrestling promotion or something like that, because there maybe isn't a lot else in the town, it can become this centre of attention. So the waiter's all excited because he's serving like Jack Spade's wife, and he's like, oh well, it's this is on the house really because of who you are. And he's like, oh, I really wanted to go to the match tonight, but I couldn't get anyone to cover my shift. And it's at this point where Stacey's friends hear about this and that there's a natural match local, and they get excited and they sort of talk her into going. And there's this interesting thing with Stacey in this episode where she's getting very, almost like she just wants a normal life, and she has to try, and it's almost like a struggle to do that, where maybe in some ways people know her through her husband, and it's sort of hard to escape that, because obviously when the waiter gets excited and then her friends get excited, but she agrees to go with them, and they go to the match, and they've had a few drinks and they're getting excited, getting into it. And there's some clever touches, like some of the conversations where Stacey kind of understands what's going on and the inner workings of wrestling, so she can sort of like comment on that, whereas they're sort of kind of lost in a way. And one of them at one point is like, well, why is he doing that, or why are they booing him, or whatever. So that stuff I thought was really clever, because that kind of feels true to life as well. But it sort of gradually takes a turn where they're having, like, even Stacey's having a good time for a while, but then when she's watching Jack and the way the crowd is, and then she sees the stuff with Ace later, because she sort of goes backstage, then her mood sort of takes a turn. But then she starts getting these aspirations, because when she's talking to one of her friends, she's like telling her about, oh, we went to this great like mountain and place in Peru. And Stacey, I think because of the sort of life they've been leading, she starts like dreaming of, yeah, let's get away. And she asks Jack later, and he says, well, he like agrees to it, but he doesn't like commit to doing it soon. Like, she says, well, why don't we go next month or something? And he's always putting up the excuse to do, well, we've got shows coming up and stuff like that. And sort of from the very first episode, we've seen this is a guy who puts wrestling ahead of his family, and it's kind of self-centered like that. But this at the end is a sort of an effective conversation which puts a nice sort of cap on what the episode's been saying about Stacey and her life with Jack, because she has a really good line, which is when Jack again is kind of a bit selfish, because he says, I don't understand it. You got to go out, you got to have a good time with your friends, and why is that not enough? And again, I think that's sort of quite self-centered, this idea is like, oh, okay, you let her go out and have a few drinks with some friends, so that almost means like she has to then be passive and not complain about anything. And she has this really good line back to him. It's because, well, they get to go home at the end, and so it's almost like, yeah, I've got to stay here. It's like they were there for the show and they saw you wrestle and be this character, but I've got to live with him, you know. And it's that thing of Jack just doesn't switch off almost. So it's almost like the persona and the wrestling never stops, because Stacey like actually lives with him. And as we saw with the waiter in the restaurant, it's almost takes over her life. So I was pleased in that they did something a little bit more interesting with Stacey in this episode, and she was sort of given more meaty stuff to do. So good episode, as I said, easily the best episode so far, and I'll be back soon with episode 4. It'll be interesting to see what direction they go with next. Hopefully it continues the momentum of this episode. So let me know what you think of Heels in the comments below, what you think of this episode. Like and subscribe. As always, you can share me out on social media too. But I'll see you guys again soon. Goodbye.